The air in the law office of Abernathy and Crowe was a specific kind of stale, a mixture of lemon polish, decaying paper, and the cloying metallic scent of greed. It was so thick you could almost taste it. I sat in a ridiculously oversized leather chair, my worn denim jacket feeling paper-thin and inadequate under the stern gaze of my grandfather's portrait on the wall. My name is Sophie Hartwell, and I was 22 years old, a fact that seemed to be both my primary identifier and my greatest sin in this room. My family, a flock of vultures dressed in cashmere and quiet judgment, had made that abundantly clear. My Aunt Carol, her face a tight mask of Botox and barely concealed avarice, kept shooting glances at me, then at her diamond-encrusted watch, as if my very presence was making time move more slowly. Uncle Robert, a man whose physical form seemed to have been inflated by his own sense of importance, was texting furiously, probably calculating his net worth as it grew with each passing second. Their children, my cousins Marcus and Tiffany, were whispering to each other, their snide little smirks like daggers in my peripheral vision. I was the family footnote, the art school oddity, the girl who had the audacity to pursue passion instead of profit, and today was meant to be my formal excommunication. Mr. Abernathy, a man who looked as old and brittle as the documents stacked on his desk, finally cleared his throat. The room fell silent, a predatory hush. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read from the last will and testament of my grandfather, Arthur Hartwell. The legalese was a drone, a low hum beneath the surface of the real drama. I didn't need to understand the clauses to understand the outcome. To my Aunt Carol, he bequeathed the sprawling condominium in Vail, Colorado. A soft gasp of performative surprise, followed by a smug little smile that she tried and failed to hide behind her manicured hand. I remembered that condo. I had been there once as a child, before my father, my grandfather's estranged son, had passed away, and my welcome had officially expired. It smelled of pine and money. To my Uncle Robert, he left the entirety of his stock portfolio, a collection of blue-chip investments and speculative ventures that Mr. Abernathy noted was, and I quote, of a considerable and substantial value. Robert didn't even look up from his phone, just gave a curt, satisfied nod, as if he were merely confirming a lunch order. The numbers on his screen had obviously already told him the good news. The bequests continued. To my cousin Marcus, the prized 1967 Porsche 911, a silver bullet of a car that my grandfather had polished more lovingly than he had ever patted my head. Marcus actually let out a low whistle, leaning back in his chair and puffing out his chest. He caught my eye and gave me a pitying look, the kind you give a stray dog right before you call animal control. To Tiffany, a generous replenishment of her already overflowing trust fund, ensuring she could continue her life's work of brunching and posting filtered photos of her travels. She sighed with relief, as if a great burden had been lifted from her perfectly sculpted shoulders. And then there was a pause. The air crackled. Mr. Abernathy looked over his spectacles, his gaze landing on me. The last item, the dregs, the punchline. And to my granddaughter, Sophie Hartwell. He read, his voice losing none of its monotone formality. I bequeath the Bosendorfer grand piano, currently located in the study of my primary residence. Silence. Then, a snort. It came from Marcus. It was a short, sharp, ugly sound. It broke the dam, and a wave of poorly suppressed giggles rippled through my family. Aunt Carol dabbed at a non-existent tear of mirth. Uncle Robert finally put his phone away, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. A piano? Tiffany stage whispered, her voice dripping with derision. The one nobody could play, the one that's been out of tune for 20 years. It's a classic, dear, Uncle Robert said, his voice booming with false magnanimity. a classic piece of firewood. Their laughter was open now, a chorus of condescension that filled the stuffy office. I felt my face burn, a hot, prickling wave of shame that started at my collar and rose to the roots of my hair. I knew the piano. It was a monstrous thing. A huge, black-lacquered beast that had sat in my grandfather's study like a funeral monument. He'd never played it. No one had. The running joke was that it was just an expensive shelf for his collection of dusty first editions. It was unplayable, untunable, and immovable. It was a burden, a joke, an insult carved from ebony and ivory. Mr. Abernathy pushed a document across the desk towards me. "If you'll just sign here, Miss Hartwell, to acknowledge receipt of your inheritance." My hand was trembling, but I forced it to be still. I picked up the heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. I would not cry. I would not scream. I would not give them the satisfaction. I signed my name, my signature a tight, angry little scrawl. I pushed the paper back, stood up, and my voice, when it came, was shockingly steady. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy." I turned to leave, my gaze fixed on the ornate double doors, a portal out of this suffocating room. "Sophie, wait," Uncle Robert called out, his voice thick with a syrupy, patronizing tone I despised. "Don't worry about the removal fees. I'll send a couple of my guys over to haul that old thing to the dump for you. No charge. Consider it a gift." I didn't turn around. I didn't acknowledge him. I just kept walking. I pulled open the heavy door and stepped into the hallway, the sound of their laughter finally muffled as the door swung shut behind me. I stood there for a moment, leaning against the cool wood, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "Miss Hartwell." I jumped. It was Mr. Abernathy. He had slipped out of the office behind me, closing the door silently. He stood before me, his face unreadable, a stark contrast to the open mockery of my relatives. "I'm sorry for their behavior," he said, his voice a low murmur. I just shook my head, unable to speak. "Your grandfather was a complex man," he continued, fumbling inside his jacket pocket. "He instructed me to give this to you, and only to you, after the reading was concluded and you were alone." He pulled out a thick, cream-coloured envelope. It was sealed with a disc of dark red wax, stamped with the familiar Hartwell family crest, the stylized H that suddenly felt like a brand. My name, Sophie, was written on the front in my grandfather's spidery, almost illegible script. I took the envelope from him. It felt heavy in my hand, heavier than just paper. "What is it?" I whispered. "I do not know," Mr. Abernathy said, and I believed him. "My instructions were explicit. Give you the letter. The rest, he said, was up to you." He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, turned, and retreated back into the office, leaving me alone in the silent, marbled hallway with my two inheritances, a worthless piano and a cryptic letter. The journey back to my tiny fourth-floor walk-up apartment was a blur. The city rushed past the bus window, a smear of grey buildings and indifferent faces. The letter felt like a hot coal in my jacket pocket. Part of me wanted to rip it open right there, and part of me wanted to throw it out the window, to sever this final, bizarre tie to a man who had apparently held me in such low esteem. My apartment, when I finally got there, felt smaller than ever. It was one room, a combined kitchen, living room and bedroom, with a bathroom so small you could wash your hands while sitting on the toilet. It was my sanctuary, a space I had carved out for myself, filled with my books, my sheet music, and the faint, ever-present smell of turpentine from my half-finished canvases. But now, all I could think about was the piano. The logistics of it were a nightmare. It was a Bösendorfer, a concert grand, 9 feet of wood, wire and spite. It would not fit in the elevator. It would barely fit through the door. It would take up nearly a third of my entire living space, and moving it would cost a fortune I absolutely did not have. My part-time job at a coffee shop barely covered rent and ramen. I sank onto my lumpy futon, the weight of it all pressing down on me. Uncle Robert's offer to haul it to the dump echoed in my ears. It was the sensible option, the only option. I could call him, swallow my pride, and be done with it. I could let the final joke play out, let them have their victory. But then there was the letter. I pulled it from my pocket and stared at it. The wax seal was perfect, unbroken. My grandfather had been a man of immense precision and deliberate action. He did nothing by accident, mocking me so publicly, then having his lawyer secretly pass me a note. It didn't fit. It was a contradiction. And my grandfather, for all his faults, had not been a man who tolerated contradictions. My despair began to curdle into something else. Curiosity. A tiny, flickering ember of defiance in the cold ashes of my humiliation. What if it wasn't a joke? Or what if the joke was more complicated than I thought? The next few days were a special kind of hell. I made the calls. The first moving company laughed when I gave them the dimensions and the fourth-floor walk-up destination. The second quoted me a price that was more than 3 months' rent. I finally found a small, independent crew who agreed to do it for a price that would completely wipe out my meager savings, the little bit I had squirreled away for a new keyboard. The day they delivered it was a public spectacle. They had to use a crane to hoist it up the outside of the building and through my largest window, which they had to remove from its frame. My neighbours gathered on the street below, pointing and staring. I stood in my now windowless apartment, shivering in the autumn air as this black behemoth was slowly, painstakingly manoeuvred into my life. When it was finally settled, its 3 massive legs planted firmly on my worn floorboards, the effect was devastating. It dominated the room. It was a black hole, absorbing all the light and space. My cozy sanctuary had become a storage unit for a single, enormous piece of unwanted furniture. The movers, sweating and exhausted, looked at me with a mixture of pity and disbelief. "What are you going to do with this thing, kid?" the foreman asked, wiping his brow. "I'm going to play it," I said, the words tasting like a lie. He just grunted, took my money, and left. I was alone with the beast. I walked over to it, my footsteps echoing in the suddenly cavernous-feeling room. The lacquer was dull with a thick layer of dust, and a long, ugly scratch marred the elegant curve of its lid. I ran my hand over the surface. It was cold, and the dust felt gritty under my fingertips. I lifted the full board, the heavy wooden cover that protected the keys. The keys themselves were yellowed, like old teeth. A few were chipped at the corners. I sat on the rickety stool that had come with it, a piece of furniture as forlorn as the instrument itself. My heart was pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. I placed my fingers on the keys, the ivory cool and unnervingly smooth. I took a breath and played a simple C major chord. The sound that came out was a jangling, dissonant horror. It was a cry of pain. The notes were sour, clashing, and dead. Some keys stuck, others made a dull, thudding noise, and one, the high G, produced no sound at all. Tiffany was right. It was unplayable. My hands fell from the keyboard, as if I'd been burned. The silence that followed was thick with disappointment. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the music stand, and finally let the tears come. Hot, angry tears of frustration and humiliation. The piano wasn't a piano. It was a tombstone, a monument to my failure, my otherness, my grandfather's final, cruel judgment. He hadn't just left me something worthless. He'd left me something that was a perversion of the one thing I loved. He had given me a silent, broken version of music itself. I cried until I was empty, until all that was left was a hollow ache in my chest, I sat there for a long time, staring at the silent keys, the sheer, oppressive bulk of the thing. I was done. I would call Uncle Robert in the morning. I would let him win. I would let them all win. I pushed myself up from the stool, ready to give up, to crawl into bed and forget this whole miserable day. My hand brushed against my pocket. The letter. I had forgotten about the letter. With a weary sigh, I pulled it out. My thumb traced the edge of the wax seal. What more could he possibly have to say? What final insult was contained in this envelope? With a surge of bitter resolve, I slid my thumbnail under the wax and broke the seal. The paper inside was thick, expensive, and covered in that same spidery script. But it wasn't a letter. It was a poem. Or a riddle. I squinted, trying to decipher the words under the dim light of my one good lamp, where twilight's first breath meets the silent chord and the river's memory floods a wooden heart. Follow the silver path, a sad king walked alone, to find the quiet truth that sets the lost apart. Listen for the echo in the falling rain and the whispered promise that banishes all pain. I read it once, twice, a third time. It was beautiful, lyrical, and utterly meaningless. It was gibberish, poetic nonsense. Was this the final joke? To leave me with a piece of pretentious doggerel? I crumpled the paper in my fist, the last of my composure finally snapping. I was about to throw it into the trash, to discard the last piece of this cruel charade, when a single phrase snagged in my mind. The silent chord. I looked at the piano, the silent, broken instrument. My grandfather had been a businessman, a pragmatist, a man who dealt in numbers and contracts. But long before that, as my father had told me in hushed, rare stories, he had been a musician, a composer. He had loved music with a passion that he had later buried under a mountain of wealth. What if this wasn't just a poem? What if it was a map? I spent the next week obsessed. I smoothed out the crumpled paper and taped it to the wall beside my futon. I read the words over and over until they were burned into my memory. Twilight's first breath, the river's memory, the silver path a sad king walked. I scoured the internet, searched through my grandfather's old business records online, looked for any property he owned near a river, any company with silver or king in the name. Nothing. It was a dead end. The piano just sat there, a silent black monolith, mocking me. Every morning I woke up, and its shadow was the first thing I saw. Every night I went to sleep, its hulking form was the last. It was driving me mad. I was so close to giving up, to admitting defeat. I was sitting on my floor, surrounded by books on local history and maps, my head pounding with frustration, when I noticed an old, leather-bound photo album I'd taken from my father's things. I'd looked through it 100 times, but this time I was looking with new eyes. I flipped through the brittle pages. There was my dad as a boy, my grandmother, whom I'd never met, and then a photo I'd always overlooked. It was my grandfather young, maybe my age, standing next to another young man. They were both grinning, arms slung around each other's shoulders, holding sheet music. On the back, in my grandmother's elegant cursive, was a caption: Arthur and Elias, after their conservatory recital, The Two Geniuses, 1958. Elias, the name echoed in my memory. My grandfather had mentioned him once, years ago. Elias Vance, he'd said, a strange, wistful look in his eyes. The most brilliant pianist I ever knew. A pity the world never got to hear him properly. A new surge of energy, of hope, shot through me. What if Elias was still alive? What if he knew something? Finding him was a challenge. He wasn't in the phone book. He wasn't online. He was, as my grandfather had hinted, a ghost. but my grandfather had also been a man of habit and loyalty. I started calling the oldest, most established music shops in the city, the dusty ones with old men behind the counter who smelled of Roseanne and coffee. On my 5th try, I hit gold. "Elias Vance," the old man on the other end of the line rasped. "Sure, I know Elias. Hasn't come round in years. Arthritis got his hands bad, but he still gets his piano tuned. Lives out in the old artists' quarter by the docks. Little blue house with the overgrown garden." The next afternoon, I found myself standing in front of a small, slightly crooked blue house, its garden a riot of untamed roses and weeds. It looked forgotten, but there was a light on in the window. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was crazy. I was a crazy person, chasing a ghost based on a nonsense poem. I almost turned and ran. But the image of my relatives' laughing faces flashed in my mind. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. It creaked open, and a man even older than Mr. Abernathy peered out. He was stooped, with a cloud of white hair and eyes that were a pale, watery blue. His hands, gripping the doorframe, were gnarled and twisted, the knuckles swollen. "Yes?" he asked, his voice a soft, papery rustle. Are you Mr. Elias Vance?" I stammered. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Who's asking?" "My name is Sophie Hartwell. Arthur Hartwell was my grandfather." The change in his expression was immediate. The suspicion vanished, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. He opened the door wider. "Arthur's girl. Good heavens, come in, child. Come in out of the cold." His house was less of a home and more of a library of music. Stacks of sheet music rose from the floor like stalagmites. Vinyl records were crammed onto every available shelf. An old upright piano, its wood scarred and loved, stood against one wall. The air smelled of dust, old paper, and brewing tea. He shuffled to the kitchen, and I followed, perching awkwardly on a stool. He didn't ask questions, just made us both a cup of tea, his movements slow and deliberate. We sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. "He was a great man, your grandfather," Elias said finally, his voice soft. "A brilliant man, and a damned fool." "A fool?" I asked, surprised. "He gave up his gift," Elias said, staring into his cup. "He had a fire in him, a talent for composition I've never seen before or since. He could make a piano weep, or sing, or rage. But his father convinced him there was no money in it, that a man's worth was measured by his bank account. So he put the music away and built his empire. And a part of him died that day." The words resonated deep within me. It was the story of my own battle, the one I was still fighting. "He left me something," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I pulled the worn, creased paper from my pocket and smoothed it out on the table between us. "He left me this." Elias picked it up, his gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle. He held it close to his face, his pale eyes tracing the lines of my grandfather's handwriting. He read it once, then he read it again. A slow, wondrous smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He let out a soft, breathy laugh. "Oh, Arthur, you magnificent bastard," he whispered, shaking his head. "What is it?" I asked, leaning forward, my own hope flaring painfully bright. "Is it a place? A code?" "No, child," he said, his smile growing wider. "It's not a place, it's a piece of music." He tapped the first line. "Where twilight's first breath meets the silent chord." That's the opening. A soft, hesitant adagio that he always said sounded like the color of the sky just after sunset. He moved his finger down the page. The river's memory floods a wooden heart. The second movement, a rushing, powerful torrent of arpeggios. And this. He tapped the third line, his voice growing thick with emotion. "Follow the silver path a sad king walked alone." That's the main theme. The melody. He looked at me, his eyes shining. This isn't a riddle. Sophie, it's a description. It's the program notes for a symphony he wrote when we were barely 20. A masterpiece he never let anyone hear. He called it The Silver King's Lament. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. A symphony, a secret symphony. The piano, the riddle, the years of silence, it was all connected. It wasn't a joke, it was a test, an invitation. Do you have the music? I asked, my voice trembling. Elias's smile was sad now. Arthur was a proud man. When he decided to quit music, he tried to destroy everything. He burned all his compositions, all of them. But this one was my favorite. I couldn't let him do it. He pushed himself up from his chair and shuffled over to a large, dusty wooden chest in the corner of the room. He lifted the heavy lid, releasing a cloud of dust motes that danced in the afternoon light. He rummaged inside for a moment before pulling out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. I stole it, he confessed, a mischievous twinkle in his eye. Copied it out by hand the night before he planned to burn it. I've kept it all these years. I always hoped one day he'd ask for it back. He opened the portfolio and handed me a sheaf of yellowed manuscript paper covered in dense, passionate scribbles of musical notation. He never did, but I think he left it for you. I took the pages from him. The paper was so brittle, I was afraid it would crumble in my hands. It was my grandfather's handwriting, but not the spidery scrawl of an old man. This was the writing of a young man, full of energy and confidence. The notes seemed to leap off the page. It was a conversation, a message in a bottle thrown into the sea 60 years ago, and it had finally washed up at my feet. "Can you play it?" Elias asked softly. I looked down at the complex, demanding music, then back up at the kind old man who had guarded it for a lifetime. I thought of the monstrous, silent piano waiting for me in my cramped apartment. "I have to," I said. The next 3 weeks were a blur of obsessive focus. I cancelled my shifts at the coffee shop, surviving on instant noodles and the last of my savings. My world shrank to the size of those manuscript pages and the 88 keys of my little practice keyboard, its tinny electronic sound, a poor substitute for the real thing. The music was a beast. It was more difficult, more emotionally raw than anything I had ever tried to play. It was full of sprawling, complex chords, lightning-fast runs, and passages of such aching, delicate beauty that they brought tears to my eyes. It was the sound of a young man pouring his entire soul onto the page, his hopes, his fears, his passion, his heartbreak at having to give it all up. I wasn't just learning notes, I was learning my grandfather. I was meeting the brilliant, fiery young artist he had been before the world had forced him to become someone else. I practiced until my fingers were raw and my back ached. I played passages over and over, hundreds of times, until the melodies were as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. Elias would call to check on me, offering encouragement and small bits of insight. "Remember the fourth measure of the Adagio," he'd say. He wanted it to sound like a single drop of rain hitting a still pond. I was in a cocoon of music, shutting out the world, shutting out the memory of my family's laughter, focusing only on the task at hand. Finally, I knew it. Not just the notes, but the feeling, the intent, the story. I could feel the arc of it in my bones, from the hesitant twilight opening to the thundering, sorrowful march of the Silver King, and finally, to the quiet, whispered resolution. There was one last step. The piece was ready, but the instrument was not. I used the very last of my money, the funds I'd reserved for next month's rent, to hire the best piano tuner in the city, an old German artisan named Klaus. He arrived at my apartment, and his jaw dropped when he saw the Bösendorfer. Gott in Himmel, he muttered, walking around it like it was a sleeping dragon. An Imperial, from the 20s. I have not seen one of these outside a concert hall in 30 years. What is it doing here? It's an inheritance, I said simply. He spent the entire day working on it. He replaced felt hammers, tightened strings, adjusted pedals. He worked with the patient, reverent focus of a surgeon. As he worked, he talked. He told me about the piano's history, about its unique extra keys in the bass, about the legendary craftsmanship. These are not instruments, he said, tapping a key gently. They are souls. This one has been sleeping for a very long time. It is angry. By the time he was finished, the sun had set. He played a single resonant chord. The sound filled the room, pure, rich, and powerful. It was nothing like the dissonant clang I had first produced. This was a voice, a real voice. The soul was awake. She is ready to sing now, Klaus said, packing his tools. He looked at me, a serious expression on his face. Play something worthy of her. After he left, I just sat in the quiet for a long time, the rich sound of that one chord still humming in the air. The city lights twinkled outside my now-replaced window. The moment I had been working towards, dreaming of, was here. My hands were clammy. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I walked over to the piano. The polished black lacquer gleamed under the lamplight, reflecting my own pale, nervous face. I sat down on the stool. The keys looked different now, not yellowed and dead, but poised and waiting. They were a promise. I placed my hands on the keys. I took a deep, shaky breath, closed my eyes, and began to play. The first notes of the Silver King's Lament filled the small apartment, the hesitant, questioning chords of the Twilight Adagio. The music flowed from my fingers, no longer just a technical exercise, but a story I was telling. The piano responded to my touch as if it had been waiting its whole life for this moment. The sound was magnificent, a deep, resonant voice that was both powerful and intimate. I moved into the second movement, the river of arpeggios. My fingers flew across the keys, the music a torrent of emotion, of years of pent-up frustration and a lifetime of unspoken words. It was my grandfather's rage and my own, intertwined. It was the sound of a cage being broken. Then, the main theme, the sad, noble march of the Silver King. The melody was heartbreakingly beautiful, a simple, elegant line of music that carried the weight of a lifetime of regret. I poured everything I had into it. My grief for the grandfather I never knew, my anger at the family I did, my hope for a future I couldn't yet see. I was no longer in my apartment. I was walking a silver path, alone, searching for a quiet truth. The music built to a final, thundering crescendo, a clash of powerful, unresolved chords, before falling away into the final movement, the whispered promise. The notes were soft, delicate, like a final, peaceful sigh. The piece ended on a single, low, resonant C, a note of finality, of peace. I held the key down, letting the note hang in the air, its vibrations washing over me. I let it decay naturally, the sound fading, fading, fading into absolute silence. And in that perfect, profound silence, I heard it click. It was not a musical sound. It was quiet, but sharp, precise, mechanical. It came from directly in front of me, from the body of the piano itself. My eyes snapped open, my breath caught in my throat. I stared at the ornate woodwork of the fallboard, the panel just below the keyboard. Nothing looked different. Had I imagined it? Was it just the old wood of the house settling? No. The sound was too clean for that. My hands trembling, I leaned forward and ran my fingers along the wood. My fingertips searched for any crack, any seam, and then I found it. A hairline fracture in the lacquer that hadn't been there before. A tiny, almost invisible seam that outlined a small, rectangular section of the piano's frame. The click had been a latch releasing. Holding my breath, I hooked my fingernail into the tiny crack and pulled. With a soft, satisfying whisper of well-oiled hinges, a hidden compartment swung open. My heart stopped. There, nestled on a bed of faded, dark blue velvet, was not one thing, but 6. They gleamed in the dim light, intricate and complex. 6 vintage watches. They were breathtaking. Even to my untrained eye, they screamed quality, history, and value. One had a simple, elegant white face and a leather strap. Another was a chunky steel chronograph with 3 smaller dials. A third was a strange octagonal shape, its bezel held on with tiny screws. They looked like tiny sleeping machines, each a masterpiece of engineering and art. And there, tucked in beside them, was another envelope, smaller than the first, made of the same thick, creamy paper, and on the front, in that same familiar script, was my name, Sophie. My fingers were numb as I reached into the compartment. I bypassed the watches, their cold, metallic weight momentarily forgotten. I picked up the letter. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely break the small wax seal. I unfolded the single sheet of paper. "My dearest Sophie," it began. "If you are reading this, then you did it. You listened. I am sorry for the theatre, for the public humiliation, but it was necessary. It was the only way to ensure this letter, and this legacy, found its way to the only one who deserved it. Your aunt, your uncle, your cousins, they are good at many things. They are good at counting money, at leveraging assets, at displaying the trappings of wealth, but they have forgotten how to listen. They hear only noise. They look at a masterpiece of craftsmanship, like this Bösendorfer, and see only a large, inconvenient object. They hear a symphony and wonder what its market value is. Their hearts are full of numbers, but their souls are empty. I knew they would laugh. I counted on it. Their greed and their arrogance were the lock, and your patience, your passion, was the only key. I watched you, Sophie. From a distance, I admit. But I watched. I saw you choose the difficult path. I saw you forego the easy money to pursue the music that I myself abandoned. You have the fire I let die out in myself. You have the artist's soul. I could not leave you a portfolio or a penthouse. To them, it would have been an admission that their way was the right way. And it is not. I left you a puzzle, a conversation, a piece of my own soul, locked away in a wooden heart, waiting for the only person in the world who would care enough to learn the song. These watches were my one secret vice, a collection of beautiful machines that appreciate the one thing we can never get back: time. They are yours now. Their value is considerable. Use it to buy yourself freedom. Freedom from debt, freedom from want, and most importantly, freedom from the judgment of small-minded people. Buy yourself time to make your art, to live your life on your own terms. Restore the piano. It is a magnificent instrument, and it has waited long enough to sing. And play for me from time to time. I'll be listening. With all the love I never knew how to show your grandfather Arthur. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through my tears. But these were not the hot, angry tears of humiliation I had shed before. These were tears of understanding, of release, of a profound and overwhelming sense of being seen. He had seen me, all along. He hadn't been cruel. He had been clever. He hadn't abandoned me. He had chosen me. I looked from the letter to the watches gleaming in their velvet nest, and then to the magnificent piano that surrounded them. It wasn't a tombstone. It was a treasure chest. And the key had been music all along. The first thing I did was not run to an appraiser. The first thing I did was make a pot of tea and call Elias. When I told him what I had found, he was silent for a long moment. Then he let out a long, slow sigh. "I knew it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew that man's heart wasn't entirely made of stone. He found a way, didn't he? A way to pass on the best part of himself." The next morning, I did go to an appraiser, a discreet, by-appointment-only establishment in the city's most exclusive district. I took only one watch, the steel chronograph with the 3 dials. The appraiser, a severe-looking woman with a jeweller's loop permanently attached to her eye, took one look at it, and her professional composure vanished. "My God," she whispered, her voice reverent. "A Rolex Daytona, reference 6239. A Paul Newman. Where did you get this?" "It was an inheritance," I said, the words feeling true for the first time. The value she quoted was a number so large, it seemed fictional. It was enough to pay off my student loans 10 times over. It was enough to buy a house. It was enough to change everything. I sold it. The transaction was quiet, professional, and utterly life-altering. The other 5 watches went into a secure bank vault, my silent, ticking council of advisors. My life transformed, but not in the way my relatives would have expected. I didn't buy a flashy car or a penthouse. I bought a small, beautiful house on a quiet, tree-lined street. A house with a music room that had perfect acoustics. And the first piece of furniture I moved in was the Bösendorfer. I didn't just move it. I honoured it. I hired Klaus, the German artisan, and gave him an open budget. "Make her perfect," I said. He spent a month painstakingly restoring every inch of the piano, from the French polish on the lacquer to the delicate felt on the hammers. When he was done, it wasn't just a piano. It was a work of art, a gleaming black jewel that was the heart and soul of my new home. I played it every single day. I played Chopin and Liszt, but mostly I played The Silver King's Lament. I didn't have to do anything to orchestrate my family's downfall. My grandfather was right. Their inheritance was built on appearances, and appearances are fragile. The news came to me in snippets. Uncle Robert's sure thing stock portfolio, it turned out, was built on a mountain of risky derivatives that were wiped out in a minor market correction. He had to declare bankruptcy. Aunt Carol's Vale condo had a massive tax lien on it that my grandfather had apparently been forgetting to pay for years. She had to sell it at a loss, just to cover the debt. And Marcus, my cousin Marcus, had wrapped the vintage Porsche around a telephone pole 2 weeks after he got it. He hadn't been able to afford the proper insurance. He was fine, but the car was a write-off, and he was left with nothing but a bill from the city for the telephone pole. Their house of cards had collapsed under the slightest breeze. It was about 6 months after the will reading. I was in my music room, working through a new composition of my own, the notes flowing easily for the first time in my life. The doorbell rang. I opened the door to find them standing on my porch. Uncle Robert, Aunt Carol, and Marcus. They looked diminished. Robert's expensive suit was rumpled. Carol's face was drawn and pale without its usual mask of makeup, and Marcus just looked lost. "Sophie," Uncle Robert began, his voice lacking its usual boom. He looked past me into the house, his eyes widening as he saw the pristine hallway, the art on the walls, and beyond, the magnificent gleaming form of the Bösendorfer. "That piano," he breathed, pointing a trembling finger. You fixed it." "I had it restored," I said, my voice calm. His face contorted into a mask of rage. "You knew!" he spat. "You knew all along. He told you. This was all some sick, twisted game to humiliate us." "He set you up, Sophie," Aunt Carol chimed in, her voice shrill. "And you let him. You cheated us out of our inheritance. I just looked at them. The anger I had expected to feel wasn't there. There was only a vast, quiet emptiness. A pity. They still didn't understand. They never would. The anger sputtered out, replaced by a desperate, grasping plea. "Sophie, please," Aunt Carol whispered, her fake tears now looking horribly real. "We're family. We've lost everything. You have to help us. Just a loan. To get back on our feet." Alone. The words hung in the air between us. And I remembered that day in the lawyer's office, the sting of their laughter, the condescending offer. I looked at Uncle Robert, at his desperate, pleading eyes, and I smiled. A small, quiet smile. "Alone," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue. "I'm not sure about alone, but I do have a suggestion." I paused, letting them lean in, hanging on my every word. "If you have anything you need hauled to the dump, you should let me know. I understand you know some guys who can do it. No charge." The flicker of hope in their eyes died, replaced by a stunned, horrified comprehension. They finally understood, not the mechanics of the plot, but the beautiful, perfect symmetry of the justice. They saw their own cruelty reflected back at them, sharp and clear. I didn't wait for a response. I gave them one last, long look. Then I stepped back inside my house. I closed the heavy oak door, and the sound of the latch clicking into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the final chord, the perfect, resonant end to their story, and the quiet, promising beginning of mine.